Is the tentative title of the proposed research. Gaze abnormalities in drivers' hazard perceptions across both daytime and nighttime conditions using simulations data. Let's cover the background that relates to my previous research and this particular study. First, gaze is dependent on context. The gaze pattern is a product of structures of attentions that interact with the environment, which is a combination of bottom-up interferences and top-down modulations. Environmental context and task demands tend to dictate expected patterns of gaze activity. An example is a curve negotiations that focus attentions on these tensions, and length change increase head movement and mirror activities. So despite these variations, saliency map models suggest that a situation's visual demand and pattern expectations can be modeled. The next one is the disruptions and variability effect on the gaze patterns. The inconsistency between the scenario demands and observed gaze patterns can be utilized by driver monitoring systems to estimate driver state. However, the definitions of gaze expectations is extremely complex, and it is subject to context and subject variability. Disruptions of patterns can be attributed to changes in either driver state or environmental saliencies. For instance, cognitive loss is associated with reduced gaze dispersions and peripheral hazards. Alcohol intoxication is associated with increase in gaze entropies. So these together are one of the possible internal disruptions. The classic example is the looming of incoming stimuli that is attributed to increased attention focus, and is a potential external disruptions. Here's how neural networks or other models can be used to understand gaze patterns. The gaze patterns of attentional behavior can be captured using mathematical models or approximators, with neural networks having higher scalability. An example is fitting the models of gaze behavior, which uses conditional entropy to estimate uncertainty in patterns of visual scanning, or using Markov chains to generate a series of gaze fixation transitions to gain insights into drivers' attention allocations. Neural networks can also be used to generate accurate predictions in gaze behavior. These methods are naturally different, but essentially, they are all about looking for patterns in gaze. The key advantages of using a neural networks lie not only in their scalability, but also in their ability to use self-supervised learning to directly capture spatial and temporal patterns in time series data, while requiring no label. It can make predictions based on trained data without prior features definitions and improving their performance across various tasks. Time series anomaly detections using a neural network define the probabilistic deviations of expected data through what we call an encoding process. Here's an example of not related to driving and in an online setting classroom, but it can identify strong deviations from normal gaze behavior, suggesting a possible attention shift or cognitive disengagement due to distractions. Here's an example of the encoding process. So this slide is going to be important because it shows how neural networks is intentionally designed with a bottleneck and constrained to force the learning without having the labels. So let's imagine you're teachers and you want your students to learn all of these. So keep in mind, these books can be replaced with any kind of data, like gaze patterns. So let's allow him to bring an A4 cheat sheet to the exam. So his score is great. He can answer almost everything. And then he went for an internship and you received his email. Like, your student is doing so bad. Like, he seems to have memorized everything, but hasn't learned a thing. What could be the problems? So this time, you're allowed to only an A5. So not bad. The score decreased just a little bit, but probably it's because you made it harder. Now you don't receive any complaint this time. So let's try again with an A6. So everything seems okay. So congratulations, your student just received an award. So basically, the encoding process is achieved by bottlenecking the training data. And in this instance of the cheat sheet, you can also see the issues with the evaluations and the way that the scores are used. This can be misleading, and you won't be sure if it will work in real life without having a mathematical concept based on human factor, and that ties us to our research gaps later. Here's a bit more details on our previous research and the new proposals. With our work at AutoUI, we assume that the training data of a given learned neural network's gaze patterns is representative of the variation space for a given task or context. So one can attribute the causalities of abnormality detections to disruptions in said context, either in terms of driver state or presence of saliences. The design of that experiment involved the drivers in automated mode. With the task of watching a videos on a phone, we assume the expected gaze patterns is directed at the phone, with deviations caused by unexpected bottom-up disruptions from Wallaby that randomly appears on the test track. Our frameworks to detect those disrupted patterns is called gaze abnormality, and it is defined as deviations in the driver's gaze under specific spatial and temporal conditions of a given task. When compared to previous observations, we call them expectations from the same drivers or from other drivers in similar conditions. The mismatch between expectations and real gaze is our abnormality, and it is measurable by a self-supervised neural network. The mismatch can be caused by either external or internal disruptions. The characteristics of our frameworks are as follows. The first premise is that gaze is dependent on context. Gaze also has different sensitivity across different contexts. The sequential relationship is many-to-many. To driving performance, the gaze sensitivities and the context can be measured, like clicking a button in the hazard perception test. For simplifications, we assume things as disruptions result into distributions, expected and deviated gaze pattern. Gaze is the most sensitive to hazard and likely to produce strong disruptions in gaze patterns. Gaze and context follows a many-to-one relationship. Our frameworks look at contextual variables, hazard, salient objects, disruption, task-oriented gaze, and disrupted gaze. There are two instances of gaze patterns. First is deviated patterns, which is a positive one because it means that the drivers allocate their attentions to the new demands. Or an abnormal patterns, which is a negative one, due to when a hazard appears, they are not paying attention and do not change their pattern at all. The issue with our research so far is noise disruptions. To understand why, we need to look at the two datasets being used. The first one is collected by Yutong, Lewis, and Ning, includes 40 participants aged 35 to 60. In the first part, participants drove in automated mode while engaged in a non-driving task of watching videos on a phone. Testing strategies included vehicle nudgings and takeover requests. With the second part, phones were removed to induce boredom, also include takeover requests. Participants drove in manual mode in the final part. The second dataset collected by Joanne involved 30 participants aged over 65. So this dataset consists entirely of manual driving. But our model is still limited, making it sensitive to noise disruptions like automated mode, like having too many gaze patterns from different tasks. In the test track, We have uncontrolled bottom-ups like wallabies. The confounding factors such as nudge, takeover requests, or the driver's demographic, and the lack of visual hazards to trigger deviated patterns. With the issues presented, here's the plan of how we can fix that with a Haro tree dataset. We will train the neural networks to learn the baseline gaze patterns under day and night cycles within a specific scenarios, assuming there's no hazard or present, and treat these as the expected gaze patterns. So day and night conditions enable us to test the robustness of the model. In the next step, the model is evaluated using a mixture of observations. First, observations from scenarios similar to the training data are used to assess true negative performance. The model is expected to produce low anomaly scores between the cases because they match the learning patterns. The model is also evaluated on observations that include disruptions, such as pedestrians crossing the street. So in this case, the model is expected to produce high anomaly scores, as these observations differ from the patterns learned during training. The final step is to statistically identify expected versus deviated patterns and explain the underlying reasons for these behaviors. Here's what we are trying to answer. With the following research gap, so despite the theoretical plausibility, the hypothesis still lacks empirical supporting evidence. A validation study needs to be conducted where the capabilities of the machine learning tool to detect evident abnormalities in experimental leads and controls comparable situations is used as a benchmark for the theoretical validity. Next are the research questions, recalling how the evaluations of the encoding process can be misleading. So, can the mathematical concepts of abnormality be used to predict changes in driver gaze patterns based on variations in the scenario? And how do expected and deviated gaze patterns manifest across different drivers when exposed to the same hazard saliency levels of day and night cycle? In the next part, we roughly describe the methodologies we're planning to use. The process begins with simple atomic representations of synthetically generated gaze patterns to illustrate how our method's going to work. So these will be replaced with the real data in the actual study. Gaussians and Markov models are selected for their simplicity and are used to generate driver gaze patterns that start from the center and gradually drift to the left. The X and Y axis represent the driver's forward-facing view. Additional patterns are then generated to represent the drivers looking to the right. Now, we have combinations of driver gaze patterns for both left and right-looking behaviors. So up to 8 observations from a total of 5 drivers are generated, focusing on the leftward-looking behavior. A separate model is created for each driver to avoid diluting results with variabilities from other drivers. For each driver, the same model is used to evaluate their unseen observations. The night observations also represent leftward-looking behavior. For the 10 observations, rightward-looking behaviors is introduced. And since the model is primarily adapted to leftward-looking behavior, the night observations is expected to produce a low anomaly score, while the 10 should yield a much higher anomaly score. So the results here confirm these expectations. When plotting the anomaly scores for all 5 drivers for the 9 and 10 observations, a clear difference between them is clear. Inter-drivers effects are assessed using a pair t-test, and it would be interesting to see if similarly distinguishable patterns emerge with the actual data. But actually in the real data, these problems become much more complex because the labels for left and right looking behaviors are unknown, and drivers can exhibit hundreds of different gaze patterns. The challenge is how to categorize or allocate these observations without knowing their underlying attributes. The pipeline for identifying the expected and deviated to solve those problems can be done as follows. Step 1. Find a scenario that has a high possibility to disrupt and triggers abnormality. Step 2. We collect multiple observations without disruptions and at least one observation with disruption. Step 3. Create a control group containing only non-disrupted observation and an experimental group that includes at least one disrupted observation alongside other non-disrupted observations. Step 4. We calculate inter-driver expected and deviated patterns by creating all possible combinations of trainings and evaluations. From the evaluations pairs, we rank and find the top K with the highest discrepancy score. In the experimental group, it is expected that most of or all evaluations contain disruptions will appear in the top K. In the control group, the discrepancy scores for all evaluations are expected to remain low. In the last step, we calculate inter-driver expected and deviated patterns by performing a pair t-test on the evaluations pairs of up to 5 drivers. In summary, what can be achieved with our method? Our method is essentially a supervised learning on time series gaze data, combining positive of non-disrupted and negative of disrupted patterns in a contrastive manner. So this enables the model to automatically extract relevant features from gaze observations within the same expected patterns categories based on contextual labels, while contrastively pushing negative samples or those from an opposite context further apart without requiring gaze data's labels. And we can statistically distinguish expected and deviated pattern. So in layman's terms, we'll be able to find the expected gaze patterns of a context and the deviated patterns, associating it with the disruptions when it occurs, with a cluster of derivable patterns from the expected patterns. Thank you for listening.